When the HOA president boxed in his ranch and locked the gate, most people expected him to cave. Instead, Anthony Ridley turned the tables with one move they never saw coming. Anthony Ridley had seen storms tear down fences before, but never one like this. This one wasn't made of wood or wire, it was made of rules, arrogance, and a padlock he didn't own. One morning in early March, just as the sun lit the rolling pastures outside Abilene, he walked out with a mug of coffee and froze. A brand new, gleaming perimeter fence stretched across his property line. It wasn't his. It wasn't even on his land. And at the center of it, the only way in or out was a steel gate with a heavy lock and a sign, "Property access managed by the Lakeside Meadows Homeowners Association." He set his mug down on the porch rail, staring. His cattle grazed inside, but now they were penned in like zoo animals. The old access road, the one that led to the county highway, was on the other side of that gate. The only key belonged to the HOA president, Marjorie Kane, a woman with sharp suits, sharper heels, and an even sharper reputation in the neighborhood. Anthony had moved here just 6 weeks earlier, leaving behind the traffic and noise of Amarillo. 46 years old, with calloused hands and a back that still ached from the last calving season, he'd saved for years to buy this spread. He'd imagined peaceful mornings, the steady rhythm of ranch work, and the sound of cattle lowing against the wind. He hadn't counted on a homeowners association, let alone one that would literally fence him in. By the time he reached the gate, 2 men in HOA polo shirts were tightening the bolts. "Morning," Anthony called, trying to keep his tone even. "Mind telling me what this is?" One of them didn't look up. The other muttered, "Talk to the board." And then he saw her, Marjorie Kane, pulling up in a spotless silver SUV. She stepped out, sunglasses perched high, clipboard under her arm. "Mr. Ridley," she said without so much as a greeting, "you've been notified of your non-compliance issues." Anthony frowned. Non-compliance with what? Perimeter fencing must match community standards. Yours does not. Until it's corrected, this measure will prevent further violations. "This measure," Anthony gestured toward the cattle milling near the fence, "that's my access road. My animals need water from the creek down there, and that," he pointed, "isn't your land." Marjorie's smile was thin. "The access easement is controlled by the HOA, Mr. Ridley. It's in the covenant you agreed to when you purchased the property." Anthony felt his stomach tighten. He remembered the stack of papers he'd signed at closing, pages of legal language no one but a lawyer could love. "You mean to tell me you can just lock me in?" "Until you comply," she said simply, turning toward her SUV. "Contact our office when you're ready to discuss the approved fencing style. Have a pleasant day." The gate clanged shut, the lock clicked, and she drove off. The 2 workers finished their task and left without another word. Anthony stood there for a long moment, hands on his hips, the morning breeze tugging at his shirt. He dealt with stubborn cattle, drought, and rising feed prices, but never someone so determined to make a point of petty tyranny. That night, he sat at the kitchen table with his neighbor, Glenn Porter, a retired trucker who'd lived here 20 years. "They've been doing this for a while. Marjorie's got the board wrapped around her finger. If she doesn't like you, she'll make your life miserable." Anthony shook his head. "I didn't move out here to get pushed around by a committee." "Then you better be ready for a fight. She won't back down, and she sure as hell won't give you that key unless you play her game." Anthony leaned back, staring at the ceiling. He wasn't sure yet how far this would go, but something in him refused to give in. The land wasn't just dirt and grass, it was his dream, his work, and his future. The next morning, he drove into town, bought a thick file folder, and started collecting every letter, every photo, and every scrap of paper related to the property. If Marjorie wanted a fight, she'd get one. But he had no idea just how personal and how public it was about to become. 2 days later, Anthony walked into the Lakeside Meadows clubhouse for his first official HOA meeting. The place smelled faintly of fresh coffee and old carpet, and every seat in the small conference room was taken. Half a dozen board members sat behind a long folding table. At the center, wearing a tailored navy blazer and a necklace that looked like it cost more than his first truck, sat Marjorie Kane. Her eyes followed him as he took a seat in the back. "Mr. Ridley," she said into the microphone before the meeting even started, "you'll be on the agenda under compliance matters." The first 40 minutes were a blur of talk about landscaping, pool hours, and a dispute over someone's mailbox color. Anthony kept his focus on the thick packet they'd given him, which listed rules about everything from exterior paint to acceptable lawn ornaments. He felt a deep sense of irritation at the sheer bureaucratic scope of the organization. When his name was finally called, he walked to the front, the sound of his boots echoing in the otherwise still room. "Let's talk about that fence you built," Marjorie began. Anthony took a slow breath. "It's the same one I've had for years on my previous property. It's functional, safe, and keeps my cattle in." "Functional isn't the standard here," she replied smoothly. "Community aesthetics are. Perimeter fencing must be uniform, and yours does not meet approved specifications." Anthony set his folder on the table and opened it. "This is a cattle ranch, not a golf course. My fencing is made for livestock, not to look pretty from the road." A man at the far end of the table cleared his throat. "Rules are rules, sir. We can't make exceptions. If we did it for you, we'd have to do it for everyone." Anthony met his eyes. "You already do make exceptions. I drove past 3 houses on my street with different fencing styles. None of them match yours, and none of them have a padlock on their gate." A few people in the audience shifted in their seats. Marjorie's lips tightened. "Those cases are under review," she said quickly. "In the meantime, you remain out of compliance. The fines will continue until the fencing is corrected." Anthony leaned forward slightly. "How about the fact that your fence is blocking access to my water source? You're interfering with my ability to care for my animals. That's not just wrong, it's dangerous." "You have other water sources," she replied. "We confirmed it with satellite imagery." Anthony let out a short, humorless laugh. "Satellite imagery? You think you can tell from a photo how I run my ranch?" A murmur rippled through the room. Glenn Porter, sitting in the second row, raised his hand. "Marjorie, the man's been here barely 2 months. Maybe we give him time to adjust before hitting him with a locked gate and fines." Marjorie didn't even glance at him. "The HOA has to maintain standards, Mr. Porter. If Mr. Ridley wants to be part of this community, he must follow the same rules as everyone else." Anthony picked up his folder. "And if I don't?" Her voice stayed calm, but her eyes were sharp. "Then we continue with fines and, if necessary, legal action." He walked back to his seat without another word, though inside, his frustration was boiling into a cold determination. After the meeting, several neighbors came up to him. Some whispered quick words of support before glancing nervously toward Marjorie. Others avoided eye contact altogether. It was clear she had influence here, maybe more than the title of president alone explained. Outside in the parking lot, Glenn caught up to him. "She's not just strict. She's got friends on the county zoning board and a cousin in real estate. People think twice before crossing her." Anthony looked back at the clubhouse. Through the glass doors, he could see Marjorie shaking hands with a tall man in a suit, both of them smiling like they just won a prize. "I'm not playing her game," Anthony said finally. "If she wants to turn this into a battle, I'll bring one she's not ready for." By the next week, Anthony's mailbox was starting to look like a courthouse filing cabinet. Each day brought a fresh envelope stamped with HOA Compliance Office. Inside were notices, each one more aggressive than the last. The fines started at $50 a day, then jumped to $100. They claimed his fence posed a visual inconsistency detrimental to community appeal. Visual inconsistency. Anthony read the words out loud in his kitchen, shaking his head. I'm raising cattle, not hosting weddings. Glenn, sitting across the table, sipped black coffee. They know exactly what they're doing. They keep piling it on so you either fold or start bleeding money. That evening, Anthony decided to attend the next HOA meeting, not to argue, but to listen. He figured the more he understood their tactics, the better his chances of finding a weak spot. The clubhouse was packed again, this time with a strange tension in the air. A woman Anthony hadn't met before, Paula Green, stood at the front complaining about a tree the HOA had forced her to cut down. She glanced at Anthony mid-sentence, then quickly looked away. When the meeting moved to new compliance matters, Marjorie glanced at him but didn't call his name. Instead, she rattled off a list of other infractions. An RV parked too. He dropped his gloves on the ground and climbed over the fence, his boots thudding against the packed dirt on the other side. The locked gate stood like a challenge, the thick steel shackle gleaming in the morning light. He rattled it hard, the sound echoing across the pasture. No movement, no one to answer. By mid-morning, Anthony was on the phone with the HOA office again. I need access to that creek immediately, he told the receptionist. My cattle can't be cut off from water. This is basic animal welfare. Her tone was clipped. Mr. Ridley, the HOA has confirmed there are other water points on your property. Those tanks are for backup, he snapped. If we hit a heat wave, they won't last a week. Do you want to be responsible for dead cattle? I can forward your concern to the board, she replied, clearly uninterested, but I can't authorize access. That afternoon, Anthony drove straight to Marjorie's house. Her place was immaculate, freshly painted siding, trimmed hedges, not a leaf out of place. She opened the door wearing a pale blue blouse, her expression polite but guarded. This isn't about fines anymore, Anthony said, keeping his voice steady. It's about my animals. You're cutting them off from water. Her reply was smooth, almost rehearsed. Mr. Ridley, the HOA operates under a uniform standard. If we make exceptions, it undermines the integrity of the community. The integrity of the community? His voice rose. You're talking about a fence. I'm talking about living creatures depending on me to keep them alive. Her expression didn't change. The rules are the rules. Anthony took a step back, clenching his fists to keep from saying something he'd regret. This isn't over, Marjorie. As he walked away, he caught a glimpse of movement behind her curtains, neighbors peeking out. The fight was no longer just between him and the HOA president. It was a spectacle. 2 days later, the first signs of stress appeared in his herd. A few cattle stood near the fence, bellowing toward the creek. Anthony brought in extra water tanks, but the process of hauling and refilling them was exhausting and expensive. She's playing hardball, Glenn said, leaning against the truck as they unloaded another tank. Trying to wear you down until you give in. She's not getting what she wants, Anthony replied, pulling a wrench from the toolbox. I'll keep hauling water if I have to, but I'm not rebuilding that fence just to match her idea of aesthetics. Still, the stress was building. By the end of the week, Anthony was running on little sleep, juggling ranch work with constant letters and notices from the HOA. One envelope included a photo someone had taken from the road, showing one of his water tanks slightly tilted. The letter claimed it was a safety hazard and demanded its removal. That's harassment, Glenn said after reading it. That's Marjorie, Anthony replied. And then one morning, the situation shifted. A for sale sign appeared on the small half-acre lot that contained the locked gate. The land was technically separate from both his ranch and the HOA's main holdings. Anthony stood there staring at the sign, the gears in his mind turning fast. If he owned that strip of land, he'd own the gate. And if he owned the gate, the lock would be his. But he knew if Marjorie caught wind of his plan, she'd find a way to stop it. Whatever he did next would have to be fast and quiet. Anthony didn't rush straight to the real estate office. He knew better to charge in without understanding the full picture.
That afternoon, he drove into Abilene and sat down with Tom Beard, a local attorney whose office smelled faintly of old paper and fresh coffee. Anthony spread out the letters, photos, and the latest HOA notices on Tom's desk. "I want to know if what they're doing is even legal, and if I buy the land with that gate on it, does it give me full control?" Tom adjusted his glasses, scanning the documents. "They're operating inside the bounds of the covenants you signed when you bought the property. That's the bad news. Those rules were baked into the purchase agreement, and they give the HOA more control than most folks realize." "And the good news?" Anthony asked. Tom tapped the photo of the for sale sign. "If that parcel really is separate from HOA ownership and it's got the only gate access to your property, then yes, you'd have every legal right to control it. But you'll need to verify that before making a move. And you'll need to make the purchase in a way that doesn't trigger alarm bells at the HOA office." "Meaning Marjorie can't know it's me," Anthony concluded. "Exactly," Tom said. "If she catches wind, she could push the seller to accept a competing offer or find a way to rezone before the sale closes. You need to keep your name out of it entirely." For the next few days, Anthony kept up his normal routine. But at night, he sat at his kitchen table drafting a plan. He contacted an old friend from college, Brett Lawson, who ran a property management company 2 counties over. Brett agreed to set up an LLC, limited liability company, under his company's umbrella, giving Anthony total privacy in the transaction. One evening, Glenn stopped by and found Anthony studying a county plat map. "You're cooking something up," Glenn said with a grin. "I didn't deny it. If I told you, I'd have to make you swear it stays between us." Glenn raised his hand. "My lips are sealed." Anthony explained the plan in low tones. By the time he finished, Glenn was grinning even wider. "That's bold, and I like it." Meanwhile, Marjorie seemed to sense something was shifting. She started showing up near the fence more often, sometimes with 2 other board members in tow. They'd stand by the gate, talking quietly, glancing in Anthony's direction. One afternoon, as he was repairing a post near the main pasture, she walked over with her usual clipboard. "Mr. Ridley, we've scheduled another compliance inspection for next week." "I didn't look up for my work." "You can schedule all you want. My fence isn't changing." "You're only making things harder on yourself." She straightened and met his gaze. "And you're underestimating me." The following morning, Anthony's phone buzzed. Brett had called to say the seller accepted the LLC's initial offer. No counter, no questions asked. The deal was set for just under 3 weeks away. It felt like the first real victory in months. Tom warned him to keep his guard up. "The deal's not final until the ink's dry. Don't let your opponent know you're already holding the winning hand." Anthony agreed. The trick was to let Marjorie think she was still in control right up until the moment she wasn't. But keeping a secret in a small community is like holding water in your hands, and Anthony was about to find out just how fast word could spread. 2 days after Brett's call, Anthony drove past the lot with the gate just to make sure the for sale sign was still planted in the ground. It was. He parked down the road and sent for a while, watching. The lot was small, just enough to hold the gate, a narrow gravel strip, and a thin line of mesquite trees, but it was the choke point for everything beyond it. Whoever controlled this strip controlled every vehicle, every delivery, and every person entering his ranch. That afternoon, Brett called again. "Title search came back clean. No liens, no disputes. Seller's just looking to unload it quick. Probably doesn't even realize the leverage it gives." Anthony smiled to himself. "Good, let's keep it that way." The next week, he kept a careful routine, but the tension was mounting. Paula Green, the neighbor who'd warned him, caught him in the grocery store one morning. "I heard the board's been sniffing around that gate lot," she said quietly, glancing around the aisle. "Don't know what they're planning, but they're talking to a surveyor." Anthony kept his voice calm. "Appreciate the heads up." That night, he called Brett. "We need to move faster. If they start bringing in surveyors, they could slow the sale or try to tie it up in court." Brett didn't hesitate. "I'll push the title company. We can get you an escrow by Friday." The days between felt like a slow boil. On Friday morning, Brett called again. "It's done. Escrow's open, deposit's done. We're locked in unless you back out. And I know you're not backing out. Let's get it closed as soon as possible, Anthony confirmed. He didn't celebrate that night. Instead, he sat at the kitchen table, making a list of every scenario. Once he had the gate, Marjorie would push back hard. She might call the sheriff, threaten lawsuits, or rally the board to write new rules. The trick now was to let her think she was still in control, right up until the moment she wasn't. The final move. The closing date landed on a gray Tuesday morning. Anthony drove into Abilene, keeping the details private. The process was straightforward because the LLC was listed as the buyer. Anthony's name never touched the official sale documents. Within an hour, the deal was sealed. The keys, a heavy silver set on a worn leather fob, sat in the center of the table. Brett pushed them toward Anthony. "They're yours. You just bought yourself a gate and a fight." Anthony picked them up, feeling the weight of the leverage. For months, Marjorie had dictated when and how he could access his own land. Now, with one twist of this key, all that power shifted. Back at the ranch, Anthony parked by the road and walked the last 50 yards to the lot. The gate stood there, the same as always, but it was no longer an obstacle. It was his. He slid the key into the padlock. It turned smoothly, and the shackle popped open. The sound was sharper than he expected. Final. He swung the gate wide and stepped back, letting the cattle in the nearest pasture wander toward the creek for the first time in weeks. That feeling lasted exactly 2 days. On the third morning, a white SUV pulled up and stopped in front of the open gate. Marjorie stepped out, heels clicking on the gravel, clipboard in hand. 2 other board members got out as well. "Mr. Ridley," she said, her voice cool, "you appear to have accessed HOA property without authorization." Anthony leaned on the gate. "This isn't HOA property anymore. I own this lot. You can check the county records if you don't believe me." Her eyes narrowed. "That's impossible. The association had first right of refusal." "Maybe they did, but they didn't use it. The seller took my offer. Now this gate is mine, and I've got the paperwork to prove it." One of the board members shifted uncomfortably. "Marjorie, if that's true—" She cut him off. "We'll see about that." Turning back to Anthony, she added, "Don't think for a second this is over. We'll challenge it." "Challenge whatever you want," Anthony said, unflinching. "In the meantime, you don't control this access anymore. I do." The legal blitz and community rally. By that afternoon, he'd received 3 separate emails from the HOA demanding immediate clarification. He forwarded each one to Tom, who replied simply, "Let them make the next move." The tension reached a new level that Saturday. Anthony was hauling a load of feed when he saw Marjorie standing at the gate with 2 uniformed sheriff deputies. Anthony slowed his truck and rolled down the window. "Mr. Ridley, we got a call about a property dispute." Anthony climbed out, holding his paperwork. "Deputies, this is my land. This lot, this gate, it's all on the deed. Bought it fair and square." Marjorie crossed her arms. "That property has always been under HOA management. He's interfering with community access." Anthony handed one of the deputies a copy of the recorded deed. The deputy looked it over, nodding slowly. "It checks out. He owns it." Marjorie's jaw heightened. "We'll take this to court." "That's your right, ma'am, but for now, there's no law being broken here." The scene had drawn a small crowd of neighbors. The division was becoming impossible to ignore. That night, Anthony's phone buzzed with a text from Paula Green. "Be careful. They're holding an emergency board meeting Monday. Word is they're pushing for new rules that could hit you hard." Monday came and Anthony showed up to the meeting early. The room was packed, the tension thick enough to taste. "As many of you know," Marjorie began, "recent events have highlighted gaps in our ability to maintain community standards. The board is proposing an amendment granting the HOA authority over any access points that serve more than one property." Anthony raised his hand. "That's a pretty convenient amendment considering you're targeting one specific owner, me." "This isn't about you, Mr. Ridley," she replied, though her eyes didn't leave his. "It's about the community as a whole." Anthony pointed out that the amendment would give the HOA sweeping powers over land it didn't own, destroying property rights. When the vote was called, the board split 3 in favor, 2 against, but the amendment still needed a majority of homeowners' votes to pass. After the meeting, several neighbors pulled Anthony aside. Frank Delgado, the wiry man, spoke in a low voice. "You're not the first person she's tried to steamroll." He revealed that Marjorie and her allies had used HOA funds in the past to push through questionable land deals related to a cousin's real estate firm. She thinks she's above the rules because she wrote them. Anthony realized the amendment wasn't her last stand. It was a desperate power grab to rewrite the rules after losing the gate. He knew what he had to do. The final power shift. The homeowners' vote on the new amendment was scheduled for Saturday. Anthony didn't waste time arguing about aesthetics or fence height. He focused on one thing: transparency and self-interest. On Friday, Glenn and Frank helped Anthony print and distribute flyers across the neighborhood. The flyers didn't attack Marjorie. They simply reprinted the proposed amendment and paired it with 2 facts: Marjorie's cousin's real estate deal. Citing public records, the flyers showed how the HOA's recent decision to rezone a community lot financially benefited Marjorie's cousin. The visual inconsistency fines. It listed the specific, arbitrary fine amounts levied against elderly residents, like Mrs. Peterson's $200 fine for an unapproved garden gnome, and Paula Green's forced tree removal. The final point of the flyer read, "A yes vote gives the board legal authority to control your private driveway, your backyard gate, and fine you into submission. The fight for one rancher's gate is the fight for every homeowner's freedom." Saturday's vote was a spectacle. The clubhouse was overflowing. As Marjorie began her defense of the amendment, the crowd was already hostile. When it was Anthony's turn to speak, he didn't attack her character. He just asked a simple question. "Marjorie, can you explain to the community why the HOA chose to spend 3 weeks and several $100s of association money fencing off a private road before addressing known property violations that actually posed safety risks?" She tried to pivot, rambling about continuity and standards, but the power had already shifted. The neighbors had read the flyers. They understood that the fight was never about his fence, but about Marjorie's control and petty corruption. The vote results were announced quickly. 12 votes for the amendment, 45 votes against. The amendment failed. Marjorie's eyes, usually so sharp, were wide with shock. Her years of unchecked authority had just ended, not with a roar, but with a community-wide rejection. Anthony didn't speak again. He simply smiled, a genuine, tired smile, and walked out of the clubhouse. He had done more than just save his ranch. He had galvanized a community to take back its freedom. The gate was his cattle were safe, and the tyranny of the HOA president was finally over. The real victory wasn't the lock he broke, but the solidarity he built.